So we are going to begin today's class. I just want to give a quick reminder about where we ended off 2 weeks ago. I know that you had a fantastic class last week with another wonderful teacher about Miriam. And today we are going to be going back in time to the historical narrative that we had started several weeks ago and ended off 2 weeks ago with our matriarch, Sarah. So today's class, we are going to be exploring the woman who was actually Sarah's successor in a certain sense, her daughter-in-law, the woman who would become the second matriarch, Rivkah Imenu. And interestingly, this is the first woman in the Torah that we are introduced to as a young child. Now, sometimes when I'm in the car and I'm listening to podcasts or interviews or things just to, stimulate, keep myself awake, depending on what's happening, there's this interviewer that I love to listen to. She interviews several women across the, business influencer spectrum. And she always starts off with a question. And I always marveled when I heard her start off with this question because it was a very powerful question to start off getting to know someone. The first question she always asks is, what were you like as a child? And it's interesting that the way people were as children usually has a direct effect on the way they are as adults. Either they continue with the same characteristics into adulthood, or certain experiences in their childhood dictate their actions or their choices in their adult life, either positive or negative. Our childhoods often are a reflection of our future. And the woman that we are introduced to in this part of the Torah is a woman that we are met with when she is a young child. We know that Rivkah was 3 years old when we are introduced to her in the Torah. But let's take a little step back and see where the introduction began. So we spoke about Sarah and how Sarah had passed away very suddenly when she heard the shocking news that her son Yitzchok had almost been brought as a sacrifice. And it was after Sarah had passed away. Yitzchok was already an adult, and Abraham had his one heir. He had other children, but Yitzchok was the one who was supposed to continue his legacy, and he wasn't married. And Abraham needed to find a wife for his son Yitzchok. Now Yitzchok, unlike Abraham, never left the land of Israel. He was on such a high spiritual level that he never actually left the land of Israel, and he was not able to find a wife in the land where they were in the city they were in. There was nobody that matched his caliber. And so Abraham sends his right-hand man, his servant Eliezer, to find a wife for Yitzchak. And Eliezer goes on his way and he travels to the city where Abraham had sent him. Abraham sent him back to the land where he had originally come from, the land where his family was, and with very specific instructions to find a wife that was suitable for someone as holy and beautiful and wonderful as Yitzchak. And Eliezer comes. He has camels bedecked with jewels and riches and beautiful gifts for this future wife for Yitzchak. And he comes to the well. And he now has this job to pick out one of these girls to be the right woman to marry Yitzchak. And so he has a conversation with God. And he tells God, obviously, I'm not quoting word for word, but God, you got to help me out over here. I need to find the right woman for Yitzchak. And he makes a little test. And this is what he says. I'm going to share my screen so you can see the exact verbiage that the Torah uses, quoting Eliezer. And this is what Eliezer says. We are in chapter 24 of the book of Bereshit, verse 14. And this is Eliezer speaking to God. And he says, V'haya, and it will be, Hana'ara, asher omar eleha, the maiden to whom I will say, Hatina kadech ve'eshta, lower your pitcher and I will drink. Eliezer is saying, whoever I will ask for some water, ve'amra, and she will say, Shetei v'gam gimalecha ashke, drink, and I will also water your camels. Whoever will agree to allow me to drink and will bring water for my camels, ota hochachta le'avdecha liYitzchak. Her have you designated for your servant for Yitzchak. Uva eda ki asita chesed im Adoni. And through her may I know that you have performed loving kindness with my master. These are Eliezer's words. Eliezer is telling God, God, please, this is the sign that the woman who I am choosing is the right one for Yitzchak. I will ask her for a drink, and if she agrees to give me water and to help me water my camels, then I will know that she is the right one for Yitzchak. That is the sign. Now, before we even get into the rest of the story, this is the first time we see the steps of a marriage becoming a relationship in the Torah. It's the first time we ever see a couple being introduced. We see the quote unquote, the dating process, a courtship of some kind. This is the first time we see this introduction to marriage. With Sarah, we're introduced to Avram and Sarah when they're long married. Adam and Chava, we spoke about how they were married right away. You know, they were the two adults in the world. This is the first time the Torah is telling us about people being matched up, a shidduch. And what does Eliezer say? Who is he looking for Yitzchak? The girl who will offer to give him water. It's interesting. You would think that Abraham and Sarah, being the greatest leaders of the time, their child would be, he should have someone who is very wise and very talented and from a great family, all the things that every parent wants for their child. What is he looking for? He's looking for somebody kind, someone who will offer him water. And this is the first lesson that we can learn from this situation, from this part of the Torah. That when we are looking for a partner, whether it's a partner for marriage, a friendship, a partner for business, any person with whom to have any type of relationship, and the type of value that we should instill within our children, that what they should look for in a prospective partner is someone with a good character. Everything else is secondary. But being kind, having a good heart, is number one most important. And Eliezer is sitting at the well, and all of a sudden he goes over to this girl, Rivkah, and he asks her for water. Now, interesting is that he went over to her. She was the first girl that he went up to. And the reason he went up to her was because when she went down to the well, the water actually rose up to her. She didn't even have to put her cup or her jug into the well to get the water. The water rose up to her and filled her flask, which further tells us that he recognized right away what a spiritually elevated soul she was. And he goes over to her and he asks her for water, and she gives him water. Not only does she give him water, she actually lifted her flask to his mouth so he wouldn't even have to carry the heavy flask of water. And then she gives water to all of his camels. Now, to put it in perspective, this is about 150 gallons of water that she was bringing for the camels, because 10 camels that have been traveling in the desert require that amount of water. And that was a huge amount of water. And she did it. And she was happy to do it. And she was lovingly bringing water for the camels. And she was thrilled to be doing this mitzvah. And we see right off the bat that Eliezer recognizes her selflessness. He recognizes her kind and caring nature, and this is the one who is perfect for Yitzchok. And so Eliezer gives her gifts, and he asks her, who's her family? We see right here that the family is secondary to the character, because someone from a good family but doesn't have the right character, well, their family doesn't do them justice. So he goes and he meets Rivkah's family, and the family that Rivkah came from is actually quite a shock. When we think of the woman who is perfect for Yitzchok, we think of the woman who is the matriarch, the second matriarch, the woman who is the mother of the Jewish people. The family that she came from, they were liars, cheaters, swindlers. They made their living on dishonesty. They were extremely self-centered. They were not good people. They did not live with a moral code of conduct. In fact, her brother, Lavan Ha'arami, as he was called, which, by the way, for anyone who knows any stories in the Torah, Lavan, he's the one who later on would switch his daughters so that one would marry instead of the other one. That Lavan, the one who cheated his son-in-law, but we'll learn more about that next week. Lavan was her brother, and she grew up in a home where dishonesty was so normal, and where lying and cheating and doing what was best just for oneself at the expense of anybody else was just their way of life. And Rivkah was different than her family. Rivkah had this inherent code of ethics that she lived by, which was contrary to the home that she grew up in. In fact, this is why Rivkah is compared to a rose. Our sages tell us that Rivkah is kishoshana bein hachochim, which literally means that she was like a rose among the thorns. Now, we hear that expression a lot, a rose among thorns. It originates with Rivkah. What made her a rose among the thorns? Well, she was beautiful, like a rose, despite growing up in an extremely thorny environment. Let's think about the rose for a minute. The thorns are actually very important to the development of the rose. The thorns are there to protect the rose. And without the thorns, the beautiful flower would be eaten by creatures before it even had a chance to develop into something beautiful. But the moment the rose is picked, we don't want the thorns anymore. Then they're just in the way. So the thorns serve its purpose for a certain period of time, but the moment they aren't needed anymore, they have to go. Rivkah's upbringing was exactly like that, which we see from Eliezer's words when he speaks to Rivkah's family. Eliezer comes to Rivkah's home, and she brings him in, and he's fed a meal, and he tells Betuel, Rivkah's father, and Lavan, Rivkah's brother, that he wants to take Rivkah back home with him to marry Yitzchok. And they ask Rivkah if she wants, and she says yes. In fact, she wants to, and she plans on going even if they don't agree. She knew that this was what she wanted, and she knew that she wanted to marry Yitzchok. And Eliezer says something very interesting. He says, I traveled from my master Abraham's home, and I arrived today. This is what she said. This is what he says. And I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see the words that Rashi tells us. Rashi says something very interesting. Rashi is the foremost commentator of the Torah. And Rashi says, Avo hayom, these are the words from the pasuk, from the verse. And Rashi, the foremost commentator on the Torah, gives us insight into what this verse means. So the bold letters over here are the words from the pasuk, which are va'avo hayom, and I came today. And Rashi says, hayom yatzati v'hayom bati, mikan shakafza lo haaretz, which literally means, today I left, and today I arrived. Eliezer is telling the family of Rivkah that today I left from Abraham's home, and I arrived on the same day. By the way, if he would have turned on his Waze or his Google Maps, he would have been told that it was a 17-day journey. It took 17 days to travel from Abraham's home to arrive in the home of Rivkah. And yet he arrived in one day. And Rashi tells us that from here we learn that the earth shrank for him, which literally means that his journey was miraculously shortened. There is a miracle that is called kefitzat haderech, when a journey that is supposed to take a very long time is shortened to take a very short amount of time. And this was a miraculous feat of supernatural event that God made a miracle for him that he should arrive in one day. And this is what Eliezer is telling Rivkah's family. God made me come right away. And this is actually a question that is asked by the Lubavitcher Rebbe and is discussed in Hasidic thought extensively. And I want to share this idea with you. The Rebbe asks, why was this miracle necessary? We know that God only makes supernatural miracles when they are extremely necessary. God runs the world in a way that runs in the course of nature. This was something that was not within the bounds of nature. Why was it so important? You would think that Rivkah was such an old woman that she needed to get married as soon as possible. Well, guess what? Anybody know how old she was?
3.
Unmute yourself if you want to share. Anybody know how old she was?
3.
She was 3 years old. She was certainly not an old maid. Why was there this intense need for Eliezer to get her out of her home so quickly that a miracle was necessary? And the Rebbe explains that it wasn't because of her age that she needed to get out of there. It was because of her environment. She was the rose that was growing up amongst thorns. She was the beautiful, honest, selfless soul who was growing up in an environment permeated with dishonesty and selfishness. And she needed to grow up in that environment. That's where God placed her. But the moment she was ready to leave, it was incumbent upon Eliezer to get her out of there. Right when she was ready to leave, when she turned 3, that's when she was ready to leave home. She needed to get out of there as soon as possible. And this tells us how we can react to negative environments. When we are in an environment that requires us to be the rose among thorns, when we are in a thorny environment, that is when we need to recognize that we need to get out of there as soon as we can. But while we're in it, we should become even more beautiful and even more strong because of the negativity that surrounds us. And Rivkah did exactly that. Rivkah managed to grow into the beautiful soul that she was, even though she grew up in such a dishonest environment. Now let's fast forward Rivkah's life many years later. Rivkah marries Yitzchok. It was a beautiful marriage. They were very happy together. And the conflict and the struggle of two dichotomies that Rivkah grew up with now presents itself in a different way. Rivkah and Yitzchok struggled with infertility. They did not have children for many, many years. In fact, Rivkah wasn't just barren. She actually had been born with a condition that made it impossible for her to physically have children. She was born without a womb. And yet, miraculously, she became pregnant. And her pregnancy was not an easy one. She was so confused about what was going on inside of her when she was pregnant. Every woman who experiences pregnancy can relate to the joy of feeling a kick. But for Rivkah, the kicks felt violent. In fact, when she would pass a house of Torah study, she would feel strong, strong kicking, which made her feel hopeful. Wow, her baby, her child inside of her really wants to learn Torah. But when she would pass a house of idol worship, she would also feel very strong kicking, which made her so apprehensive. Why is her child so excited about idol worship? And she was so confused. What is this child growing inside of her that is such a contrast between Torah study and idol worship? And she went to the great sages in the yeshiva of Shem Va'ever, which, by the way, is interesting because she was married to Yitzchok, who was such a great Torah scholar, but she did not go to ask him because she didn't want to worry him. So she went to the teachers at the yeshiva of Shem Va'ever, and they told her that she has two children growing within her. And these two children are like fighting nations that are opposing each other, even in her womb. And that was how she found out that she had twins. And when her twins were born, there could not have been a bigger difference between the two of them. Her eldest, her firstborn, was Esav, who was born red and hairy and grew up to be a forceful, aggressive, strong-willed, brilliant outdoorsman who spent his time hunting in the fields. And her second child, born just a couple of seconds later, was Yaakov, a sincere, sweet, earnest Torah learner who spent his time at home in the house of prayers, in the house of studies, connecting with God. They couldn't have been more different, both in appearance, in personality, and in their life's goals. And Rivkah was now once again faced with this contrasting struggle of raising these two children and trying her best to bring out the best in her two children. And this was something that took extensive wisdom. And this was something that took a lot of common sense and hard work. She really had to do everything in order to understand her children and bring out the best in them. And now we get to the famous story where at the end of Yitzchok's life, Rivkah's husband, Yitzchok, wants to give his legacy to one of his children. He wants to bless one of his children with the blessings that would make him his successor. And Yitzchok calls his son Esav into his room, into his private chamber, and tells him that he plans to give him the blessings. He tells him to go into the field, prepare him a delicious meal, and when he returns with a meal, he would give him the blessings. And Rivkah overhears this and understands that Esav is not the one who deserves these blessings. Now, Yitzchok was actually blind. Torah tells us that Yitzchok was not able to see at the end of his life. There are different reasons why he lost his vision. Some say that when the angels cried, when Yitzchok was laying on the altar about to be slaughtered, the tears of the angels entered his eyes and contributed to his blindness. As well, Esav had several wives. His son Esav had several wives who all served idolatry. And the smoke from their idol worship blinded Yitzchok as well. And Yitzchok was not able to see. And there are those who can think that perhaps Esav managed to fool his father into thinking that he was the right one for these blessings. Esav was an extremely evil person, but he had extreme respect for his father. And he managed to, despite all of his other selfish behaviors, he managed to always treat his father with the utmost respect. And he also, because of his brilliant mind, would engage his father in very interesting discussions, asking very, very intellectual questions about Torah knowledge. Questions that were only able to be asked if one has a very strong understanding of Torah and a very strong understanding of the world. And you might think for a moment that, well, maybe Esav managed to fool Yitzchak. But the truth is that Yitzchak knew exactly who his son was. But Yitzchak approached the world from a very idealistic perspective. And Yitzchak felt that if he would give his son Esav the brachot, the blessings, then Esav would become the epitome of everything that his potential was. And he would become the perfect leader of the Jewish people because he had all of the worldliness that is necessary in order to relate to people. And he had the intelligence that if he would apply himself to Torah knowledge, he would be able to do that as well. But Rivkah was the mother. And Rivkah really knew her children on a practical level. And she recognized that although ideally it would be lovely for Esav to use his potential, she knew that Esav would never really harness the blessings in the proper way. And so now Rivkah had to intercede. And now Rivkah had to do what a mother does best. She needed to change the situation. And so while Esav was out hunting, she brings her son Yaakov close to her and she says, listen, you are going to bring this meal that I prepared exactly the way Yitzchak likes it. You are going to bring this meal into your father's chamber and receive the blessings. And Yaakov turns to his mother and he says, but won't my father recognize that I'm not Esav? If he touches my skin, he'll know right away that I'm not Esav, because Esav was extremely hairy and Yaakov was not. And so Rivkah takes goat skin with hair on it and she covers Yaakov's arms with goat skin. And she puts Esav's special coat, which he had given to his mother for safekeeping when he went out to the field. And she puts it onto Yaakov and she dresses him to feel like Esav. And Yaakov, being the honest, very, very careful with honesty, being the honest boy that he was, well, man that he was, he enters his father's chamber And his father says, famous words, Hakol kol Yaakov. This is the voice of Yaakov. The hayadayim, and the hands, yadei Esav. They're the hands of Esav. Meaning it sounds like Yaakov, but it feels like Esav. And he asks Yaakov, are you my son Esav? And the words that Yaakov uses are quite fascinating. Because Yaakov valued honesty tremendously, because this was something that his mother had taught him, which is interesting because remember, Rivkah was raised in an environment of complete lack of honesty. And yet, she was so different than her roots. She was so different than her upbringing that she raised her children with the utmost honesty. That the words that Yaakov says, the words that Yaakov tells his father reflect his value of honesty. The words that Yaakov says, and I'm putting them up here so you can see. Vayomer Yaakov el Aviv. And Yaakov said to his father, Anochi Esav bechorecha. Now, literally, they can be translated to say, I am Esav, your firstborn. Now, that is a lie, because he was not Esav, his firstborn. But grammar plays an important role, because the word Anochi Esav bechorecha literally means, I am Esav, your firstborn. But if you add a little comma right over here, it now reads, Anochi, I am, meaning I am whoever I am, Esav bechorecha. And if we translate it like that, we can add a little word over here. And if you can see the way I'm writing, you can see that we add the word, Esav is your firstborn. With perfect honesty, he managed to keep his value of saying the truth. I am whoever I am. I am the one bringing you the food. And Esav is your firstborn. This was what his mother had taught him. The importance and the value of honesty. And Yaakov receives the blessings. But if we take a step back, we see that this was an extreme challenge for Rivkah. She was in a really tight spot, right? She was in a corner where she needed to get her husband to give the blessings to Yaakov instead of Esav. And what method did she use? She used trickery. Now, if we look at that at face value, it almost seems disappointing. She worked so hard to be different than her family. She was the rose among the thorns. She moved away from the negative upbringing that surrounded her for the first 3 years of her life. And now we see it that she's reverting back to this negative behavior. That seems so disappointing. Couldn't she have found a way to do it without tricking anybody? And if we look at it from that perspective, it seems quite negative. But if you've been here long enough, you know that Hasidic thought and the Hasidic perspective on Torah takes these stories and flips it on its head to show us the inherent positivity in this story. We need to look at it from the exact opposite perspective. It wasn't that Rivkah unfortunately grew up in a home of trickery and those negative traits never left her. No, it's the exact opposite. God, for whatever reason, needed Yaakov to receive the blessings in an indirect manner. And Rivkah was the one that God needed to make this happen. And that is why Rivkah had to grow up in a home of trickery and dishonesty. So she would have that tool in her toolbox to enable her to do this mission that God had in store for her. So it was actually the negativity in her life was there as the purpose in order for her to be able to use this method for what God actually intended it to be. And this gives us a completely new perspective on negative things that we have in our lives. Because Rivkah had a negative experience in her childhood. And we can each relate to that because we all have negative things that surround us at some point in our lives, whether it's in our childhood, whether it's in our young adulthood, in our older adulthood. We all have times that have been negative experiences. And those experiences are meant to teach us lessons. Like Rivkah, we try to get out of them. But there are tools that become part of our toolbox. And if God gives us these characteristics, they are there for us to be able to use them for something purposeful, for something beautiful, and for something that will have a positive impact. And this idea is what Rivkah truly aspired to teach us. She didn't look at her past and say, you know, I came from such terrible people. I don't want to have anything to do with that. I'm going to remove myself from the situation and never think about it again. Yes, she removed herself from the negative situation. But no, she didn't forget about it. Instead, she utilized the tools that were in her toolbox. She utilized the inherent trait of trickery that was within her for something positive. She transformed the negative trait into something that had positive application. Now, I'm going to ask you all a question. Please do not answer this out loud, but think about it on your own. Please think about 2 positive character traits that you possess. 2 good things about you. All right, anybody want to share?
Yeah, I'm good at sticking to routines.
Okay, good at sticking to routine. Very good.
I like to make lists.
I'm sorry, say that again.
To make lists, you know, follow through, make lists.
Okay,
Organize.
excellent. To make lists, be organized, follow through. That's a great one. Anybody else?
I'm persistent.
Okay, excellent. Anybody else? Even if you don't want to share, please think of them.
I'm a good mom and grandma.
Okay, beautiful. All right, now I'm going to ask you a second question. This one you definitely don't have to answer out loud, but you're welcome to if you'd like. Think of 2 negative character traits that you have. I'm going to say that it's probably easier to think of the negative ones than the positive ones because we're so quick to judge ourselves. But you know what? All of those character traits are given to us by God. The positive ones, God has given us, and we need to work on making them stronger. And the negative ones are also God-given. Now, that doesn't mean we should just throw our hands up and say, oh, well, God made me lazy, so lazy I will be. Or God made me short-tempered, so short-tempered I will be. No, God gave us these characteristics so that we can become better people. But you know what? Every single characteristic is a full package. There's the positive side of it and the negative side of it. When we meet a person who is very easygoing, It's a wonderful thing to be easygoing. But you know what? That very easygoing person might also have a hard time keeping their commitments. The person who is very, 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 very quick to anger, we look at them like that's so terrible. You know what? That person is also extremely passionate. The person who is very, very, very patient, that's a beautiful thing. They might also let people step over them when they're supposed to put up stronger boundaries. Every person is a complete package. And we have the positive side of the characteristics and the negative side of the characteristics. The person who, and I'm not talking specifically to all of you individuals, but using the examples that we have given right over here, the person who always make lists and is very, very organized might have a hard time being flexible to change. And the person who, I'm just gonna put it out there, the negative trait that some of you or that I might have been thinking about, the person who is very, very quick to get angry or to argue with other people, that person can channel that and take up a good cause, start a protest. If you like to argue, start protesting for a good cause. If you're very, very easygoing to the point of not having strong boundaries, use it to invite a lot of guests, whatever it is. Channel the negative trait that you're thinking of and use it to create something positive. The same is with negative experiences. The same is with challenges. Channel those negative bits of energy that are inside of us into something positive. And when we do things like that, what we're actually doing is making every part of our lives into something that has meaning and value. There's so much in our life that is so beautiful. And there are some parts of our lives that we cannot always see the inherent beauty of. But that's what we learned from Rivkah, that the difficulties in our lives are there for a purpose. So we can either focus on the difficulty or we can focus on the purpose. And that's what Rivkah did. She recognized that she needed to get out of her upbringing of dishonesty and swindler style brother and father. She needed to get out of there. And as we learned from what Eliezer told Betuel about the quick journey that he had, that the moment she needed to get out of there, it was worth making a miracle to get her out of there. But that doesn't mean that she, Rivkah, should just forget about her upbringing and push away any of the negative experiences that she had. But rather, on the contrary, she embraced the struggle and used it to accomplish something extremely, extremely important. And it was thanks to her actions that we are here today, because it is due to her wisdom that Yaakov was the one who received the blessings. She set into motion a chain of events that led to Yaakov actually running away from home, because you can imagine that Esau was not too thrilled when he got home and found out that his brother Yaakov, his nemesis, had stolen his father's blessings, the blessings that he felt were rightfully his. And Yaakov was forced to run away from home, and he ended up going back to the place where Rivkah had come from, to Laban's home. And it was there that he married his wives, which we'll learn about, God willing, next week, Rachel and Leah. And it was there that he bore the 12 tribes, which brings us to where we are today. It was Rivkah's ability to channel her negativity in her life and recognize that it was really there in order for her to make a positive impact that allows us to sit here today, each in our own homes, on Zoom, in the comfort of our couches or dining room tables, and learn Torah. Rivkah accomplished that. And we can be like Rivkah. We can channel her energy and her strength, and most importantly, her perspective, and don her clothing in order to bring about positivity from the darkest moments of our own lives as well. Now, Rivkah, with all of her beauty and her grace, was truly the one who merited to be the second matriarch. As we know, the Torah tells us that when Rivkah married Yitzchok and she entered into his home, the miracles that had been present in Sarah's tent were transferred now to the tent, to the home of Rivkah. Once again, the candles burned from week to week. The challah remained fresh all week, and the cloud of glory hovered above her tent. Let us remember this. Rivkah was a woman who grew up in a home of extreme toxic negativity. And yet, she was worthy to be our matriarch. Our upbringing, our backgrounds do not define us. Our actions are what define us. A person once came to the Lubavitcher Rebbe and mentioned that he was doing outreach with individuals who had no Jewish background. And the Rebbe stopped him and said, "There is no such thing as a Jew without a background, because we are all children of Abraham, Yitzchok, and Yaakov. We are all children of Sarah, Rivkah, Rachel, and Leah. And let us look to their lives and their stories and truly recognize that as well. We are the daughters of Rivkah, and we have the potential that Rivkah has given us to take negativity and turn it into positivity. And more than that, to recognize that the negative things that happen in our lives are really God putting them there for us to do something meaningful and purposeful. And the negative traits that we have within ourselves can also be channeled for something positive. So on that note, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and share. And I would like to invite all of you to share if anybody has ever had an experience where either any of you who would like to share had an experience where you were able to channel something negative and turn it into something positive. Does anybody have anything they'd like to share?
I think it's interesting how in the Torah, going back to the first part that you were saying, that the test that Eliezer had established for Rivkah was actually something difficult, because it's easy for, say, like with words, people to appear kind and caring, but it's interesting how she had that very difficult task that she needed to achieve in order to enter into the family.
You know, it's interesting because the test was really a test of character. And the test of character that Rivkah showed was authentic kindness. It's very easy to act kindly when the cameras are on you, or when, you know, there's an ulterior motive, or you're just paying lip service to it. But when it comes to real kindness, when it involves difficulty and it's not easy, and one still behaves kindly and selflessly, that is the mark of true kindness. You know, many people nowadays are presenting themselves in a certain manner. What matters most is the characteristics that a person exhibits when there isn't all eyes on them, when it isn't easy to do, when it really involves effort. That's what really demonstrates a person's real character.
I just have one question on that. Have you seen in any commentaries, why is it that she did not offer water to his servants? In other words, the entourage that Eliezer came with.
That's an interesting question. The Torah actually doesn't really mention specifically the people that were with him. In the Torah, we don't really see much mention of the people that were with him. And it's indicated that, she was giving him and his camels, whoever in his group needed, she was obviously giving. But the Torah specifies that he came with camels, and so she fed him and his camels. Any other questions?
I just want to say it's possible that he was the only one with the camels, since he got to where he needed to be in one day. Maybe there was only room in that time frame that God made for only him and the camels, and that was the way of the test. In other words, it's possible that no one made it through the other, I would say the other side, or I don't know exactly. I mean, it's not easy to shrink time or to shrink. That's something that's only God can do.
100%. That's an interesting perspective. Thanks for sharing. All right, ladies. Well, if anybody has any other questions, please feel free to unmute yourself. And
Yes, I do.
yes, Ellen, is it?
Yes, Ellen, yes. In the very beginning, when you started talking, you mentioned that Abraham was a holy man and couldn't leave his home. I didn't
Yitzchok,
understand.
yes.
I didn't understand that. Yitzchok, why couldn't he leave?
So Yitzchok was almost offered as a sacrifice to God. Yitzchok, his entire being was permeated with extreme holiness. And so it was Yitzchak's mission to always remain in the Holy Land of Israel, in a place that was completely permeated with holiness. That was his life's mission. And so whereas Abraham journeyed within Israel and out of Israel, Yaakov as well left home and traveled to other countries and then returned to Israel. Yitzchak was always in Israel because of his inherent holiness. Yitzchak's presence in Israel was part of his mission in the world.
Okay. I'm trying to see how this relates to the Rebbe about not going to Israel.
That's an interesting parallel. The reason for the Rebbe not going to Israel is very different, because this is talking about someone who never left Israel. But the Rebbe's entire being was always one of being the shepherd who is always with his flock. And much like Yosef Hatzadik in the times in Egypt, where Yosef was actually buried in the Nile while the Jews were in slavery, so that he was always there with his people through their exile. The Rebbe always remained with us in the diaspora in New York. His home base was in New York, and that's where he remained with his people. And from New York, from his home base, once the Rebbe left Europe, was to spread outward, but always to be with the people, to be with us, to never leave the flock, so to speak.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, that's a great question. All right, ladies, I'm really looking forward to seeing you all next week, God willing. And it was lovely spending this time with you today. Have a wonderful rest of your week. And if anybody has any other questions, I look forward to answering them all next week. So have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye, ladies.